Okay, so picking up right where we left off, the first thing that I'm going to do before I go any further is I'm going to make sure that I comment on these 2 lines of code that I've created. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to say create a dictionary reader from source file so I can access my column headers. Okay, and actually this is going to let us do a couple other things. This will also help navigate row by row. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of the printing of the field names. Actually, I'm not going to get rid of it. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to say, look, I want to actually write those field names to my output file, right? So I want to have column headers in my new file naturally. So I'm actually just going to change this a little bit, and I'm going to say, okay, actually what I need to do first is I want to say, I want to create a writer. So I'm going to say CityBike writer equals CSV dot, so I'm going to CSV dot writer. And then what do I want to be writing to? I want to be writing to, I'm going to be using output file. Okay. And the reason again why I want to do this is because because that writer type, so I'm going to say create writer for my output file, is that it's going to let me, it has another built-in function that very easily lets me say, hey, I just want you to write a row of data to my file, right? A whole row, which is nice. We don't want to have to do this manually, right? We wouldn't have to say, you know, field, comma, field, comma, field, comma, right? That would be super annoying. So instead, I can just say CityBike writer.write row. I think that's it. And escape is going to get me out of this annoying thing. And I'm just going to copy this up to the right row. Now, I can go ahead and test this right away. And what I'll hopefully get is I will get just a file that says called filteredstationresults.csv, and it's going to have my field names in it. So in order to do that, I just come back here. I can actually use the up arrow key, and that's going to bring back the last command that I ran. So since basically I'm just going to be running my Python file each time, I can just use that up and then hit enter again. Now, you'll notice that I didn't get any output. I like to call Python a no news is good news program. Print, which is the command that I used before, will spit out whatever I tell it to print right in the console here, right? So I can see what it's doing in real time. In this case, I didn't tell it to print anything. I told it to write it to my output file. And so how can I check if this worked? Well, first of all, because it just kind of went to the next line without any junk in between, that's Python's way of saying, okay, I did it. Right? It's just sort of like, yeah, I did it. But it doesn't give you, it doesn't explain what it's doing. If it doesn't throw an error, then it's okay. And so that's why I say it's a no news is good news kind of program. Now I can check this because if I come to Python scripts, first of all, I can see that, hey, there's a CSV file here. And if I go ahead and open this with my text editor, voila, right? Something actually went into that file. That's pretty cool. So I'm going to come back to Aptana now and get on with my with the rest of my to-do list here. So the next thing that I want to do, so I'm going to make sure that I explain what's happening for every line of code. So I'm going to say, okay, CityBike. So I'm going to say write column headers to my output file. Okay, and to do this, I'm using CityBike writer, not writer. Okay. So now the next thing that I need to do is if I scroll back up here, I can see I need to go through my source file line by line. Now, how am I going to do that? So again, I'm going to be using CityBike Reader, not source file, because again, CityBike Reader it has some things that it can do to the file kind of built in that are going to be really handy for me. So what I'm going to say is actually quite simple. I'm going to say for a row in CityBike Reader, okay, and I show this with a colon. So you can see, so what did I do just there? Well, first of all, you can see that like import, the for and in turned blue. And what that means is that those are, we call those reserved words. Those are words that have a special built-in meaning in Python. Okay, so we can't use them standalone. I mean, we can use them standalone in a comment, right? We can put anything we want in a comment, but they have a special meaning. And basically what the for in construction does is if the second item is a list, then it says for each item, right? And so I decided to describe my items as a row because it is a row. The City Bike reader, basically, when I make it this dict reader, what it does is it treats that CSV file as a list of rows, right? Which kind of makes sense because if we look at it in a spreadsheet, it kind of looks like a list of rows. And so what we're saying is for a row in City Bike reader, it's going to go through, what this is going to do is going to go through the contents of that file line by line. So in a sense, I've basically completed what I wanted to here, which is going through the source file line by line, but now I need to say, okay, if the start station ID is the one that I'm looking for, I need to check and see what the start station ID is in each row. Okay, so now that I'm going through row by row, I'm going to have the option to say, now I need to do the next thing, which is, if the start station ID is the one I'm looking for, write it to my file. So I'm going to say, okay, if a row start station ID, and in my case equals, and I'm going to choose 72 just because I can. Okay, so what's happening here? First of all, what I'm saying is exactly what it sounds like. If the value of start station ID in this particular row, in the current row, is 72, then do something, right? Now, the question is, well, a few questions that probably pop up here. One, why is it double equals? Well, if you notice, when we're labeling things, we use a single equals sign. So if I want to test whether two things are equivalent, I have to use a double equals. That's how I say compare these two things as opposed to label this thing on the right by the thing on the left, right? So that's the reason why we have the double equals. Now, if I find out that that is the case, that my start station ID is 72, what am I going to do? Well, it turns out that I actually have to, I'm going to say new row equals. What I have to do is I have to create a new list. Okay, so I need to create an empty list. And I need to say, and then I need to take every value from my row. So this is where I do actually have to go through piece by piece, right? So I have to get the value for start station ID and time duration and trip duration and all of that. I need to go through that. I need to create a new list with those values, and then I need to write those to my output value. So the thing I'm going to do here is I'm doing my test. I'm saying, look, I'm going to go through line by line. So I'm going to say, here I'm going to say for every row in my data file, I'm going to check if start station ID is 72. Okay. Now, the only way that it's going to get to this code here, right, and you notice I have these indents, the only way it's going to get to this new row code is if the start station ID is 72. So I'm going to say, okay, if it's 72, create an empty list. And now I'm going to say, I'm going to go through the values that appear in every column in that row, and I'm going to add them to that new row, every column in the original row, and add them to the newly created row. So to do this, I'm actually going to use another for loop, right? Because really each row is just a list of values. So I'm going to say for col header, right, in each row, in a row, right? I'm going to take the value. I'm going to take the value that is in that's in that column for my current row. So again, this is probably seems like a little bit of a tongue twister, but I'm going to say, look, I'm going to take my new row, okay, and I'm going to append, just as we understand in English, I'm going to add to the end of that row. I'm going to add the value, okay, so I'm going to go to my current row, and I'm going to add what is in column header. Okay, so basically, oh, sorry, it's not for column header in a row. Sorry, it's for column header. It's for every column header in my data set, which is actually this. CityBikeReader.fieldNames, right? Remember that CityBikeReader.fieldNames is just all of my column headers, right? So I'm saying for every header in that field name, so that means trip duration, start time, stop time, etc., I'm going to go through and I'm going to say, look, take that at start, right? There's an empty list called new row. Add to the end of that list the value, okay, in a row that appears under column header, okay? So the first thing it's going to do is going to say, okay, trip duration. Give me the value of trip duration for a row and add that to the end of the list, new row. And it's just going to go down the whole row doing that. So basically what I'm doing is I'm rebuilding my data row kind of from scratch here in order to be able to write it to my output file. And so how do I actually write it to my output file? Well, we already know how to write something to the output file. I'm just going to say city bike writer dot write row. And in this case, the row that I'm writing is new row, right? Now, how does this change from each one? So what I want to show you, so let's go through and do the annotations here, right? We'll do the commenting. So what I'm going to say here is say for every column header in my data set, right? I'm going to come through here and I'm going to add the value that appears at under that column header in the current row to my new row list. And now, once this is finished, and this is sort of, you can tell because its City Bike Writer is at the same indent level as the for. So what it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, for every column header in City Bike Reader field names, do this. And it's going to keep doing that until it runs out of field names, right? So it's going to do it all the way from trip duration on down to, I think gender is the last one. So it's just going to keep going until it runs out of field names. When it runs out of field names, it will then go to this bit and it will say, write that row to the data set. Okay, now our final piece of work here, if we go back up again, this is very important. We have our list here is I'm going to close all my files. So to do that, it's very simple. I literally just make sure that everything that I've used an open command with, I now use a close command with. So I'm going to say source file close. It doesn't take any ingredients, it just knows to close it, right? That's all we're doing. It's a pretty simple task. Close, right? Okay. And I'm going to save this. Now I'm going to run it and see how it goes. Oops, there's an error. So let's take a look at this error because we will get errors. That's not a problem. No reason to panic. They are a natural part of the process. So what it's saying is file start station in module city bike writer and it says city bike writer is not defined. Okay, what that means is, hey, you're trying to use a label that you haven't actually created yet. You're talking about this label, this variable, City Bike Writer, but you never introduced me to City Bike Writer before. What gives? Now, of course, I'm like, of course I've done City Bike Writer. It is right here. However, if we look closely, we'll notice that there is a capitalization difference. And this is where we go back to the computer being the most anal retentive copy editor you've ever met, because even things like little capitalization will make a difference here. So if I fix that and I try one more time, now again, this often we might look at this and be like, oh no, the program is crashing, right? But again, in this case, no news is good news. So no errors means that it's doing its work. And when it returns to that prompt here, that means it's done. So now I can check my results and see if I have succeeded in filtering my data. And indeed, it appears that I have. Because there we go. So it's a little hard to see here. I would want to open it up maybe in Open Refine. I don't actually know how much data I have. And I know the highlighting on this is kind of weird, but every start station ID here is 72. So as you can see, we were able to filter all of our data in just a few seconds using Python, which is why this is such a powerful tool. All right, that's all. I look forward to seeing you all next week.